President of the League of Women Voters of Boulder County, and we're pleased to have such a good turnout tonight. Thank you to our sponsors, the Lafayette Library, Ranked Choice Voting of Colorado, and Approval Voting USA. And thank you to the League team members who really, there was a team of about 10 of us that put this together. I'm not going to name everybody, but thanks for all the work that you did. The mission of the League of Women Voters is to encourage the informed and active participation of citizens in government, work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influence public policy through education and advocacy. We are nonpartisan, never endorsing a candidate or a political party. We are 100% volunteers, and the League is not for women only. So any men in the group that you'd like to join, we'd love to have you. Our emphasis this year is voter education and services, money and politics, and voting methods. And there is a handout in the back as you came in. It's long and narrow. It looks kind of like a bookmark. And these are all of our events that we are doing in the foreseeable future. So please take a look at this and take one home, and take one home for all your friends. We invite you to look at our website, to follow us on Facebook, and to join us on Meetup. Upcoming is our new Drinks and Dialogue series on the Electoral College, redistricting, and voter suppression. So we think the time is right for many of these issues. Please consider becoming a member and helping us empower citizens to shape better communities. We have a donation box in the back. If you're so inclined, we invite you to make a voluntary donation to the League. Okay, I will stop the commercial message now, I promise. Some basic rules before I introduce the speaker and we get started. Rob, our speaker, Rob Richie, will give his presentation, and then we will have a question and answer session after that at the conclusion of his presentation. Questions will be submitted in writing, and there are cards and pencils for your questions. Ushers, would you please wave your hands or stand up? We have two ushers. They will be passing out the note cards and the pencils if you have a question. They will bring one to you whenever you're ready. The moderator for the question and answer session is going to be Celeste Landry. She is the head of our voting methods team. Celeste, did everybody see you? Wave. Tonight, for the first time in our history, in our 86-year history, we are live streaming on Facebook. And our plan is to post this recording on our YouTube channel. So look for it there, and please keep your fingers crossed that this actually works. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Rob Richie has been the executive director of Fair Vote since co-founding the organization in 1992. He has played a key role in advancing, winning, and implementing electoral reforms at the local and state levels. Rob has been involved in implementing ranked choice voting in more than a dozen cities, cumulative voting in numerous Voting Rights Act cases, the National Popular Vote Plan in 11 states, and promoting voter access proposals like voter pre-registration and a lower voting age. He is a frequent media source and has been a guest on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, NPR's All Things Considered, and Fresh Air, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and NBC. Rob's writings have appeared in every major national publication, as well as in 9 books, including as co-author of Every Vote Equal, about electoral college reform, and Whose Votes Count, about fair representation voting. He and his wife, Cynthia Terrell, have 3 children. And in a previous life, Rob even lived in Boulder County. So welcome back to Boulder County, Rob.
Hello. So thank you. Well, and I am excited to be back in Boulder. I did live here back in 82, 83. Things were a little different then, but the mountains were there, and it was a really great time to be there as a kid and a young person. It's a fascinating time to be gathering and talking about these issues, and I'm so glad that so many of you came out, and the League of Women Voters for bringing us together. I'm an active and proud member of our local league in Montgomery County, Maryland, And it really, truly is the sort of the quintessential grassroots group all around the country with chapters forming these kinds of meetings, and just, you know, hats off to the nearly 100 years, right, of late history. Its founder, by the way, Carrie Chapman Catt, was a big fan of ranked choice voting and proportional representation. The connection goes back for some time. And the League has studied these issues in a number of states. As I gather, the League is doing it here. And I think about a dozen leagues or close to it have come out in position to some degree in favor of changing our electoral system. It's an important conversation to have. Can everyone hear me okay? Am I holding the mic in a good spot?
Bring the mic a little closer.
Closer. Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Here we are. So as I flew out to here, I was sitting next to someone who was saying, you know, the line that if elections mattered, you know, they wouldn't let us do them, right? If the voting really mattered. Obviously, with my organization, Fair Vote, and I'm sure with people in the room, there's a point of view that votes do matter. There are consequences to elections. And as part of that, the rules matter too. And it's easy to just sort of play the game and accept the rules. And kind of a good example that I often use is basketball, which I enjoy as playing and watching. Almost all the rules that we use were sort of what they first came up with in the first week, when they were just like coming up with how to do some of these things. They did change a little bit over like the three-point shot and some other things, but like the height of the basket, like the peach basket kind of fit just like 10 feet high, and you know, this, that, and the other thing. And it's a game that's really good for tall people, less good for small. You know, I like really wanted to be a professional basketball player when I was young, and then, you know, there were probably many reasons why that didn't happen, but one was I'm just not very tall. So it's a game that the rules kind of advantage people who are tall. But you can imagine like the court could be 3 times as big, and like little quick people could like outspeed these, you know, taller people or whatever. There's things that you could have like a separate side basket or something like that. Or, you know, like let's democratize basketball. But you know, it's a good game the way it is. But when it comes to elections and democracy, we really do want to have a system where it doesn't advantage certain kinds of people over others, or you know, we really want every vote to be counting. And the rules matter, and they need to be examined and re-examined often. We have an advantage in the United States of being a democracy that is you know, one of the oldest constitutions that has been continuous. A lot of our electoral rules go back to the 18th century. We have made a lot of important changes over the years, thank goodness. You know, suffrage has really expanded a lot, you know, and that's good. And there has been some growth in the sort of the understanding of having elections and running them better and differently. But a lot of things we actually haven't really looked at very closely. We're sort of stuck in a certain rut of doing things that really has put us behind many other nations in a way that you know, it's not sort of casting aspersions about the state of America to say that our voter turnout really is lower than almost every other modern democracy. Our voter registration rates are lower than almost every other democracy. Really, that we could drop the almost. Like, we are really bad on voter registration. We create conditions that I think are highly questionable for having, you know, the kind of elections that we want. You know, like clearly a lot of interest and focus on the presidential election last year, and it's a system. I do work on the National Popular Vote Plan for President, have been a long-time critic of the way we hold our presidential elections. But you know, one consequence is that you live in Colorado, I live in Maryland, and your votes matter so much more than my votes, just because your state happens to be the line and mine isn't. And what's that all about, right? You know, so 14, 15 states get all the attention, and literally all the attention, and 35 states don't get any. Like, it's a consequence of rules that are statutory and, you know, we think should change. And there's other issues with the Electoral College that are on people's minds as well. But that's a rule. It's a conversation we can have, and a lot of states are. And actually, every state has considered the National Popular Vote bill. It's passed in 10 states. In D.C., it's passed in both chambers of Colorado at different times. It's a good conversation to have. We also have a single-member district system for congressional elections. So one person represents each area. and that's true of Colorado state legislative elections, many of our other elections, sort of prioritizes geography, where you live, really over what you think, right? So your representation is defined by your neighbors, not necessarily by your sort of thought partners who might not be your neighbors, right? And there's a lot of different ways that people hold elections. But when you have single-member district elections, in the climate we're in right now, the great majority of them are really done by the get-go, right? You know, they're sort of decided already. We do a report called Monopoly Politics where we project winners without knowing anything about the cycle that's coming up. So we actually projected winners 2 days after the 2014 elections in about 86% of US House races for November 2016, because we were pretty conservative and we wanted to be perfectly accurate, and we were. Every race we called accurately 2 years before the election, because all we needed was the extra data point of who had won the 2014 elections and by what margin, and we could sort of add that into our pretty simple algorithm and generate that kind of predictability. We had a year of really interesting voter restlessness last year. You know, the way that the primary season went, and Bernie Sanders rising up in the Democratic primary, and Donald Trump rising up and winning the Republican nomination. Ted Cruz, you know, who was a sort of outsider within his party, actually being sort of his main opponent. So there's a lot of sort of foment, a lot of vote for change. And then we have US House elections, and you know how many incumbents lost last year? 8. Yeah, 98% return of incumbents. And it's a huge margins in most races and so on. You know, about 40% of state legislative races only have one person run. And that's tied largely to a single-member district system, and we'll touch on a base that could, a way that could be changed. So the focus of tonight primarily is another aspect of things that actually had a really interesting thing happen last year relating to it, which is how we elect one person when they win, or for when a one-winner race, like governor or those US House races with one seat and so on. We generally use two kinds of systems: the plurality vote system, where you vote for just one person, or a runoff system, where you vote for one person, and if no one gets half the votes, you have a separate election, like the Denver mayor race. The plurality system is the dominant one, right? So that's where you vote for one person, and whoever gets the most votes wins. And if you have two people running, that's a pretty darn good system, right? Because there's two people, and you vote for one, and you don't really probably want to also vote for the other one. And so, you know, it's one-on-one, and whoever gets more votes has majority, and you kind of have a nice, clean election. However, what if more than two people run, right? And so you're only voting for one, and you look at sort of the split of votes, and the person with the most votes might not have half the votes. That's why we sometimes have runoff elections, but we usually don't have runoff elections, so we just allow the person who has the most votes to win. That was true actually in a number of the states in the presidential race. A number of the key states were not won with half the votes. It's true in a number of our significant elections. Sort of the primary season, the Republican primaries had a lot of candidates. The first primary won with more than half the votes was the New York primary, which was at the end of April, really late in the season. So all those other primaries were won with less than half, and almost certainly if a lot of those races had been one-on-one, there would have been a different outcome. These rules matter. It also sort of affects the pattern of how you behave in election when you are looking at the candidates and you're trying to calculate how to cast the strongest and most effective vote that you can. Why don't I'll go to this PowerPoint. We'll see how it works with the technology of being on Facebook and things, and my not being able to see it. But I guess I can step up here, right? Is that okay if I do that for the video?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh, excellent. So ranked choice voting, and so we're going to focus on another way to vote, and what makes it pretty interesting, and what that picture relates to, is this system is used in a number of cities: Minneapolis, Minnesota, St. Paul, Oakland, San Francisco, about a dozen cities in different places, Telluride, Colorado. It just passed statewide in Maine, and we'll get into why that happened and why it matters and why it might relate to Colorado. When we get to questions, by the way, I'd love to kind of talk about anything else that might have come up here. And let's just run. So here, let's go ahead and do the next slide. So to us, a strong democracy, fair vote is a nonpartisan group, by the way. We do not take sides in the candidates, and we really are trying to be a voter-centric group. And those are our kind of core principles: competitive elections, real choices, issue-based campaigns, fair outcomes. I would add, collaborative policymaking and getting things done too. Let's go to the next one. And those are the core issues that we work on. I guess our sensibility, I've been doing this for a long time. I helped start the group with John Anderson, some people might remember, ran for president in 1980, is still around, a great guy. So we want big ideas that we think really get to the core of what will make our elections work, but ones that we also think can win. And that's been a core part of our vision as well. So the National Popular Vote Plan for President became very exciting to us because it was a way to deal with the Electoral College barrier to those outcomes that we wanted, but it's state-based. It's something that states can do, and a number of states have passed it. Fair Representation Act for Congress, going to be a lift, but it is a statute, and we'll get into what it matters, why it matters. But it would be a system that, by statute, essentially could put all of us in a congressional election where our vote was sought, made a difference, and almost all of us would end up being represented. Quite a difference from what we have today. Constitutional right to vote, that's, we'll see if we can get there. Sort of, we would hope we could do that one, right? It's like, let's just have a clear, explicit right to vote in the Constitution, which we do not have. And a lot of the climate of how we talk about suffrage and how we hope the courts will protect it, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and the fights over basic access are tied to that absence. And that's one that we would like to say, let's just agree on that as a principle. There is a right to vote proposal in Congress today. And then ranked choice voting, which we'll talk about now. So it did pass statewide in Maine, 52%, and it was a citizens' initiative, and it was most of the signatures were gathered in a single day by volunteers in November 2014. It's also used to elect the President of Ireland, Mayor of London, Parliament of Australia, passed in about 15 cities, actually more, I think. Some of the bigger ones that have passed it that haven't yet implemented are like Memphis, Tennessee, Santa Fe, New Mexico, which hopes to do it next year. But it's used in about a dozen cities, including the ones I mentioned earlier. And what we think it does fundamentally is give your vote more voice. And that's a good thing for us. Okay, let's go to the next one. So Maine passed ranked choice voting because they have an ongoing issue. They're sort of an interesting state, a lot of independents, a very high turnout state, by the way, second highest turnout in the country last year. But a lot of voters who will, maybe vote for Republicans like Susan Collins and Olympia Snow, turn around, vote for Democrats like Shelley Pingree. They have an independent U.S. Senator, Angus King, almost had an independent election for governor in 2010, and have in the past. And so they regularly have more than two choices, and they regularly have people not win with half the votes. That has sort of created a climate in Maine where people actually really talked about these problems about how to handle voter choice. And they have a very sort of interesting, controversial governor, Paul LePage, who won his contest in 2010 with 37%. And a lot of people think he wouldn't have won one-on-one against either of the other top candidates. And so when you only can vote for one person, it has certain consequences. And one is this issue of do you vote for whom you really want at the potential expense of helping to elect the one you really don't want, right? So if anyone has sort of struggled with this question, sure, and it can happen in a primary, by the way, too. Do I vote for the person I really like, but if I do that, I'm not making a choice between the strong candidates, and I sort of split the vote. And the spoiler argument. And Howard Dean, the former Vermont governor, had a very good op-ed in the New York Times this past fall, and just said, let's just put a piece in this fight that we constantly have between whether third parties should run or not in our system, and just let the voters work it out. And that's what sort of ranked choice voting is designed to do. So let's go to the next one. So a runoff election, I think, is a very reasonable, better system than plurality, right? So So it upholds the principle of majority rule. Like France is going to have a runoff election. It's going to be actually or a presidential election that probably will go to a runoff, by the way. But they've got kind of a spectrum of candidates, but they want to make sure that the winner gets more than 50%. And so if you don't get more than 50% in the first round, they'll have a second round. And so the sort of the lore in France, vote your heart in the first round, vote for whom you want in the first round, and vote for whom you really don't want in the second round. Right? But you get to do that first one first, right? I mean, maybe you get a chance to vote for the one you really like, maybe both times. But there's sort of like a different, you can sort of express your voice and still make sure you get a majority winner. The problem with runoffs and why we don't see as many of them, we see them at a local level quite often. I'm just wondering, how many of you are from a city that you think has like a runoff election, or like a 2-round system where you have to win over 50%, like Denver does? Are there any other cities that, what's that city? Denver. Oh. So a lot of you don't have that. Okay, that's interesting. But a lot of cities around the country do. And it essentially are like kind of our primary system kind of gets you there, right? Because we have sort of Democrat, Republican primary, Republican primary, and then the sort of like one at the end, or when suddenly there's third parties and independents. But like sort of the general belief is sort of it's going to be one versus the other. But runoffs have these downsides, and particularly when it's sort of challenging to run elections, which they seem to be here, and they cost a lot more money. The turnout often changes. So about a number of states in the South have primary runoffs for Congress and so U.S. Senate, U.S. House. We looked at the last 195 congressional primary runoffs. The average decline in turnout was 35%. So a lot of people don't come back for the second round. And if it's not Congress, but something like Secretary of Agriculture in Texas or something, the turnout will literally sometimes be like 2% in the runoff after like 39% in the primary, which ain't that great in the first round either, but at least it's better than 2%. And you have to spend a lot more money as a candidate to run, right, in sort of a different electorate, a different election. So we've sort of looked at this issue over the years. A lot of states that used to have runoffs don't. Even though I think there sort of was interest in the majority principle, and I think it's those sort of administrative issues. So that then at the end of the day, you end up not ending, sort of getting the sort of majority principle upheld. Let's go to the next one. So ranked choice voting is saying, well, are there ways to get there to essentially simulate, even maybe improve, right, the idea of a runoff and do it in one round? And so think about what you're doing in a runoff. So you're a Denver voter. I don't know. It sounds like other people aren't Denver voters. But in a runoff, you vote in the first round, and then the top two candidates advance. And if your favorite has advanced, you'll probably vote for them again. You might change your mind, but you probably will vote for them again if you get out to vote. And then if your first choice didn't make the runoff, you got to sort of settle and make your decision about the top two. Well, ranked choice voting essentially is trying to allow you to do that on a single ballot. And what you're doing is you're saying, okay, my favorite controversial choice here is chocolate, second vanilla, third strawberry. So you're expressing your preferences first, second, and third. And what you're doing with those votes is essentially simulating an instant runoff. I think the next slide is going to get into what that looks like. Let's go to the next one. Yeah. We're sort of hastily putting some of this together because I got some slides in and I sort of added this in. So so what you do is you sort of add up those first choices. I hope there's going to be a next slide. Let's see if there is. Oh, there isn't. Okay, sorry about that. I was worried about that. So what you would do with the instant runoff is you would sort of have these votes cast, and you'd say, oh, we don't, in this case, we don't have someone with over 50%. If you have a 50% winner, you're done, right? It's just like the runoff. You don't have a runoff if someone gets over 50%. If you don't have someone with over 50%, the candidate in last place is out, and then their ballots are looked at, and only their ballots, and they're added to their next choice, right? And so then when you get down to two, and you sort of do it round by round, so the best picture will be selected in the Academy Awards, by this system. You know, they've got 9 film movies this year, I think. So they'll kind of go one round by round, and La La Land will win at the end. But probably La La Land won't win in the first round, right? And there's a lot of good options, and people have their preferences, and it's sort of like a little boiled down to two. So that's the gist of what it is. You know, you're having that ballot, you're adding the votes, you are then using those votes to kind of simulate a runoff. That's why it's sometimes called instant runoff. Let's go to the next one. So these are a way of showing different kinds of uses of it going on out there. So these light green are states where cities are using it, including, as I mentioned, Colorado. We've got Telluride. Basalt someday will have its 3-candidate race for mayor. Come on, Basalt. I thought they were going to do it last year. No. And when they do, they will use ranked choice voting. There'll be really interesting elections this year in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Open seat race for mayor in St. Paul, Minneapolis. California, some pretty big cities: Oakland, San Francisco, San Leandro, and Berkeley. There we go.
You were.
And then let's go back one, just briefly here. One of the interesting uses is a number of those southern states use it in a kind of a sort of a way that helps explain the system. They are the ones that they have these runoffs, right? The primary runoffs that I mentioned. And there's a law passed that upholds the rights of overseas voters to be able to vote in elections. And it's a really good law to be able to say that if you're serving in Afghanistan or wherever you may be, you should have a right to vote in our big elections. And so there's a pretty big gap between, or you need to send ballots out about 6-7 weeks before the election. And if you have a runoff, that means that pushes the second round pretty far away. So 5 states now keep the runoff closer, and they send those voters a ranked choice ballot. They get the ranked choice ballot, they send that out with their regular ballot, and if there's a runoff, they can just go to the ranked choice ballot and count it in the runoff for whichever candidate is ranked highest. And so, you know, liberal bastions like South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi. And interestingly enough, it's about to pass in another liberal bastion, Utah, which is actually going to very likely pass a lot of established primary runoffs, but use this ranked choice ballot for the overseas voters.
Party use means primaries? Is that what
Party use is that they use it in sort of interesting sort of party elections, like the Iowa Democratic Party just had their election of state chair, and they had 7 candidates. And in those situations, they often do repeated voting, right? They'll say, let's vote again, let's vote again. And they're sort of simulating ranked choice voting. And that's what Robert's Rules of Order suggest when you're in person like this. Let's all pick a leader, let's vote, let's vote, let's vote. And we finally get over 50%. But they decided they'd rather do ranked choice voting, in part because they said that will really encourage people to research the candidates beforehand, find out more about them, not sort of do gaming in the room, get it done in one round. And they actually seem to feel really happy about it. So it's sort of interesting, this just happened a week or two ago. It was like there's sort of the Clinton forces and the Sanders forces, and the person who won sort of was someone who seemingly bridged that divide, and people seem happy with the outcome. And it's done, like Utah Republicans use it for a lot of their party contests. All right, let's go on to the next one. So these are 2 quotes. So I sort of talked about it probably in sort of a technical way about numbers and, you know, 20 percentiles and so on. But here's at the end of the day what ranked choice voting does in elections, which is that when you have more than 2 candidates, the candidates know that they might need to win by being second or third choices of other people. It really changes their behavior. The ones who do best, it doesn't necessarily change their behavior. Some candidates do this anyway, right? And there's some great candidates who just, under any system, kind of do this. But it really rewards the candidates who just connect with people, and if they find out that, you know, I'm talking to Chris, by the way, Chris is with ranked choice voting, Colorado. Thanks for starting that. Talk to Chris, I find out he's supporting someone else, he's not supporting me, and I'm like bummed, briefly. And then I say, let me make a case for why this conversation should continue, see if I can maybe earn your second choice. And if I've talked to enough people and I know who his first choice is, I sort of begin to know what might make him tick. Like what issue? Like he's like really into some particular issue, and I sort of, because the candidate who's his first choice is really good on that issue, and then I sort of like find my common ground. Now you can't do that with everyone, but one person who did it really well was Betsy Hodges, who's the mayor of Minneapolis. Actually, it was she'll be tested because she has a contested race to be reelected this year. But in 2013, she had a really challenging election because it was an open seat race, first big use of ranked choice voting for an open seat race for mayor, really easy ballot access, and 35 candidates ran. Whoa! Now, they didn't have debates with all 35, but they had debates with like 9, right? And they would have like sort of 9 serious candidates, and then they had sort of other more funky candidates, Jack Sparrow and people like that. But the system really led to a style of campaigning that she ended up doing quite well in, because she needed to find connections with a lot of people, and they don't poll in most local races. And, people knew she was a strong candidate. There's another guy spending more money and doing TV ads who thought people was the front runner. But she's, as she says, the campaign is remarkably positive. You can't just play to your base. You have to be in an entire community. When she went and did her victory speech, the first line was, "Welcome to ranked choice voting, Minneapolis." And it's because what she had been able to do was sort of figure out a way to connect with a lot of people. She ended up being ranked first, second, or third by 60% of voters in that kind of big field race. She won, I think, about 35% of first choices, but sort of connected with enough people. And so she went from being someone who was a sort of a second choice favorite to actually winning 60-40 in the final two-choice round. Michael Brennan ran, he was elected mayor of Portland in 2011, and there were 15 candidates in that race. And I should say, by the way, there's no intrinsic reason why these ones had lots of candidates run, but it sort of welcomes the idea. More people ended up ranking 15 than voting for only one. That was pretty important, sort of indication of it. First-time use, city didn't really spend any money on voter education. We did a little bit on voter education, some of the local civic groups, but more than 99.8% of people cast a valid ballot. He got, I think, 26% of first choices, but ultimately he was ahead in first choices, but sort of rose up. And he sort of makes this point about, I ended up focusing on all Portland voters as opposed to just looking at targeted voters. And both of them had run in previous non-RC races, and they had longer interviews sort of talking about the difference of the targeting or something, like you just expand your targets, you expand your conversations. And I think that's a good thing about that we should appreciate about ranked choice voting. The study that was done in 2013, 2014, there was this study of how people perceive ranked choice voting. It found that there was a noticeable, sort of measurable difference in people's perception of the level of civility and positive campaigning. Doesn't go away, not perfect, but it did make that better, and more contact with candidates, which I think sort of makes sense. Since they've adopted it in the Bay Area cities, they hold those Bay Area city elections when they have votes for president and governor. The number of people who skip those races has declined. It'll only be like 2% now in the Oakland mayor's race, and so there's more sort of engagement of people. Let's go to the next one. So I know that there's sort of this whole conversation about approval voting. Some folks who I work with sort of put together some slides on approval voting. I'm going to be pretty quick on these slides. Here's what I'll say about approval voting, which is that there are uses of approval voting which I think are useful and valuable. The basic idea of approval voting is that it's the outcome looks like a kind of a plurality vote, and the candidate with the most votes wins when you add up the votes. The difference is you don't have to vote for only one person. So you can vote for more than one person. You're sort of expressing your approval, and if you vote for 3 people, they each get 1 vote. So you theoretically could have contests won like 70 to 64 to 60 or something like that, because more than one person can get over 50%. There was an interesting use of approval that shows kind of one way it can be useful. The Oregon Independent Party has ballot status in Oregon. They had an internet primary, the one that they were using as sort of a way to nominate candidates, which they had the right to do for president and for other offices. But they asked people opinion about what their priorities should be in the next legislature. And they had multiple options, and they said just approve of the ones that you think are something that you care about. And in that kind of way of sort of allowing people to say that I care about things, they weren't limited to one. And like the top one maybe had like 82% approval, the next one 79%, and so there was a lot of people casting approval votes. Now here's where the flip side of approval voting is those same voters also had a chance to vote for picking a presidential nominee. And the party put forward actually pretty famous candidates like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And if one had gotten over 50%, they were going to then sort of invite them to be able to be on the November ballot, on the ballot line. In that contest, those same voters who had actually approved of a lot of different options overwhelmingly did not approve of more than one option. Most people just voted for one person. And it's sort of an interesting difference, right? Because it's voting for candidates, it's voting for you're getting a little bit more tribal, and you're sort of like getting into like who you really want to win. If you look at that ballot, if you're voting for Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King, those are two pretty good choices. And Anne May to Aquash, who I guess I should know, but I don't. Those are equally weighted, and if you really like one more than another, or you sort of like one more than another, you have to make that decision. Do I vote for both? So my belief about approval, like there's going to be legislation on approval voting as a local option. I hope it passes. I think that it's a good conversation for localities to have about different voting methods, and to me that seems like a reasonable one. If I was a city councilor, however, I would be going with ranked choice voting. I'll just briefly explain why. So let's just go to the next slide here. So the main issue is that question about how you handle your ballot and the challenge of not being able to vote for more than one without that second choice counting potentially against your first choice might actually help defeat your first choice, right? So the result of that is that a number of people end up not voting for more than one person, even though, say, in a ranked choice election, they would rank more than one candidate, right? So that, say, when Oakland has a mayoral race, San Francisco has a mayoral race, we've now seen multiple ones, about 75% of people rank 3, 90% rank 2. In approval voting elections like that, probably would be more like 30 to 40% might approve of more than one, which is more than one and noticeable, right? But it also is different as far as the ultimate kind of outcomes that you get. The other problem is, and here we go to the next slide, it creates these sort of strategic issues, because which group of voters do it and which don't, right? So if some voters figure out not to approve more than one and others do, it's sort of like in a simple way, like imagine that Clinton and Sanders and Trump were the three choices in November. And let's suppose in this scenario, if it had been either Clinton or Trump, or Clinton or Sanders against Trump, that they would have had more than 50%. And in ranked choice, presumably most people who ranked Sanders or Clinton would have ranked the other one second. And a good bet that if they had majority support, one of them would have defeated Trump, whoever got more votes. In approval, they'd be in a really difficult situation, right? Because a lot of Sanders people might prefer Clinton to Trump, but do they prefer Clinton to Sanders, right? And they would sort of have to say, no, I'd rather have Bernie win, right? Or, and so it sort of gets to those issues. And then if one side does it and one doesn't. So there's been some studies of this, and Nicholas Tiedemann is one person, and he sort of says it's a voting system's particularly prone to strategic voting, has some rating system. And then there's another paper that has come out more recently that their analysis said approval voting would be subject to strategic manipulation 28% of times, ranked choice voting 2% of times, which is not 0% of times, but less. And plurality voting, of course, we often see that kind of strategic stuff. So it's not so it's not that systems like approval voting is necessarily worse than plurality. It's just that for my choice, I would rather have ranked choice voting. Let's go to the next one. I'll just use one election close to home. Approval voting doesn't have nearly the track record of ranked choice voting, so we don't have a whole lot of elections to study. Ranked choice voting, by the way, is used in all these international elections, Australia, New Zealand mayors, London, whatever. Lots of associations, party leader elections. The Conservative Party of Canada right now is having a ranked choice voting election to pick its leader, just as the Liberal Party did a couple years ago. But one use of it, sort of interestingly, is the University of Colorado. I think is the student director of elections. You see, I met him earlier.
He couldn't come.
Couldn't come. But anyway, he's going to be trying to make student elections work in Boulder, and they have votes. So this was the 2014 election. It was a 3-candidate race in this one. It was a non-majority outcome, and looking at the number of voters compared to the number of votes cast, it looks like actually only 1% of people decided to approve of more than one candidate. Now that's an extreme case of sort of bullet voting, but it is actually pretty comparable to what we often see. We can go to the next one. Dartmouth uses it in student elections also, and interestingly, they had ranked choice voting. And do some of you know 538.com, the Nate Silver blog, of course, and Harry Enton? Mm-hmm. So Harry Enton was at Dartmouth and was like a approval voting fan, and he sort of behind the scenes manipulated things, and without a vote of anybody got it changed to approval voting. And he got sort of the favorite candidate off the ballot too. So he had sort of a successful little machination thing there. But they went to approval voting, and since they've had approval voting, the number of votes cast for winners has declined on average quite a bit. And it's not with the number of voters, it's just the number of votes, because people are starting to approve less. And the average number of approvals, say in the 2016 election, was 1.17, meaning the great majority of people just voted for one. Now, some people did it, right? And that gives the people a little more power than one. But we would say that's still not the kind of outcome that I'd like to fight for, which is why we fight for ranked choice voting. Approval voting has some advantages also of it can be used on current voting equipment, and that's a real advantage. Ranked choice voting, you often have to come up with changes to your voting equipment, and something that is all solvable. But so there are reasons to consider it, but that's sort of the basics of why we support ranked choice voting. Let's go to the next one. One thing I'll just say, there's a lot of sort of math-based critiques of ranked choice voting, but keep in mind, if you think runoff elections are a reasonable way to elect people, the sort of math critiques apply to runoff elections just as well. Here's kind of a good stat for us. There's a lot of data about ranked choice voting elections out there, and of the 138 elections in the Bay Area, many of which have had multiple rounds to determine the winners, every single time the quote-unquote Condorcet winner has won. The Condorcet winner is the one who, if you look at the rankings, would defeat every other candidate one-on-one, meaning that was sort of the consensus winner. And in every case, that's happened. It doesn't always happen, but it almost always happens. And it has happened in every single Bay Area election. And if it had been plurality, it would not have happened, because there's been some races. And actually in runoffs, one of the winners was a candidate who started off in third. Let's go to the next one. Let me just briefly talk about this, because I want to get to questions. So I'll leave you with too little to talk about this, but I wanted to get back to something I talked about earlier, which is congressional elections, that kind of inert nature of them, and a relatively severe partisan skew in them, which I think is worth a conversation just when we talk about accountability. If you look at the elections this year and project Democrats winning about 55% of the vote rather than sort of close to half the votes that they did, they actually still would not have won half the seats in the US House. So you can have a system where you can get 55 to 45 advantage and not actually win half the votes. There's an issue of sort of accountability and responsiveness that I think is that every system in a sort of a democratic small d system needs to kind of have this kind of responsiveness. And we have some issues with our current way of holding elections. So if you look at the 2018 elections, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Democrats can take the House if they get 56, 57% of the vote. So the Fair Representation Act is a bill that's going to be put into Congress in a few months. And it's been sort of in development. Some people are sort of excited about this. And it's a statute. So why we have single-member districts is a statutory decision. And the elements of the system are, one, it'll be a ranked choice ballot. And let's go to the next slide. Oh, this has more funky things. Yeah, you can go through. So voters rank the candidates. You have one vote. So unlike ranked choice voting, as I've been talking about it most tonight, you're having more than one seat. That little handout, if you see the purple handout here, this is a little summary of the system. And maybe let's jump to the next slide. Go on to the next one. All right. So one state we'll just sort of use as examples. The state of Louisiana. The state of Louisiana has 6 House seats. And they're colored red and blue because it's the underlying partisanship of the districts. Actually, all 5 Republican districts are more than 60% Republican, and the one blue district is more than 60% Democratic. In the presidential vote, all of them are being won by landslide by one major party or the other, meaning that's pretty darn unlikely that the minority party is going to win. And in fact, they never do. And that's sort of the general way that we're really sort of stuck in kind of like very clear ability to know who's going to win. So what you do with the Fair Representation Act is you would combine districts, have more than one representative, so you'd have just a single line in the state of Louisiana and have 3 winners on one side and 3 on the other. You'd rank your choices, and because you're electing more than one candidate, the number of votes it takes to win declines. The goal is to have as many people as possible help elect someone. It would take about a quarter of the vote, a little over a quarter to win 1 seat, a little over half the vote to win 2 seats. This is used in Ireland and in Scotland and Australia's Senate, and it has an interesting history, including right here in Boulder. It used to be used for the city council. It expands the number of people that help elect someone. If you go to the next slide, or you can sort of, let's zip through the bullet points. So there's some particulars about the proposal. I wanted to just look at this slide. So we use this cool system. We're actually going to put this report on our website next week, so check it out. But we worked with this guy who did something called auto redistrict. So the bill has certain criteria that's going to govern how the multi-seat districts are drawn. And we had them create districts sort of based on this criteria, sort of sample districts. So we didn't kind of rig them afterwards or anything. It's just like, okay, let's have the criteria drive them. And you look at these, so these are the new districts. So Colorado, rather than having 8 districts, would have 2. And so you have bigger districts, but you can win with a lower share of the vote. But every single district, in every single state that has at least 2 seats, so you can have more, rather at least 3, would have access for both major parties. Both major parties would almost definitely be able to win in every single part of the country. So you would not have those sort of dead zones that we're sort of stuck with now. So Manhattan would have Republicans winning it, and the Panhandle of Texas would have Democrats. And if you have a threshold of 17, 20, 25%, and no spoiler problem because of sort of the ranked choice feature, independents and third parties can challenge and hold the major parties accountable and win if they can get 15 to 20%. You'd also have sort of a very likely kind of stretching of who wins within the major parties, because they wouldn't just be one faction that kind of wins the primary and then controls the general. So it's a form of proportional representation. It's sort of an American candidate-based method. And I just wanted to kind of leave you with that thought that there's sort of democracy can be much more than what we have today. And that's a statute, and it would sort of level the partisan playing field, create these opportunities for our voters. And it's all of a continuum, right? So you can love ranked choice voting the way they passed it in Maine and not be ready to do this, but it is an application of it that I think would sort of really transform the congressional election part of our system, which I think is right now one of the very problematic pieces of it. I think that's the last slide. Has more fun bullets. Yeah, so we can just leave it there. So, why don't we go to some questions?
Is anyone collecting?
So, we do have a couple of assurers, card collectors. We have one question to read, and the question is, to change the voting method in Colorado, including U.S. House and Senate, so those would be federal elections, would you need an amendment to the Colorado Constitution, new state legislation, or could an initiative do it? So those are, one is statutory, one is a Colorado Constitution, and then the third question is an initiative, which could be either statutory or a constitution.
Okay. Well, I won't pretend to be a Colorado attorney, but I can know this, which is that congressional elections are always statutory. So Coloradans can change how they elect Congress by statute, and it could be done by initiative. There is a requirement currently, a statutory requirement that Congress put in place in the 60s that requires single-member districts. So Colorado cannot use that multi-member district proposal I was just talking about for the House. There's a proposal, there's actually a bill that was just put in the legislature in Maryland, just to think about, which is that several, I think 7 legislators in the Maryland House put this in, and I think the state senator is doing it too, which is inviting other states to join Maryland in a conversation. It's called the Potomac Compact, because it would start with Virginia, to say, let's look at having an interstate compact, recognizing that Maryland is like a hellacious Democratic gerrymander. They like just nailed the Republicans, and it's a state that it's 7-1 in a state that's like, should be more like 5-3. But they did it because they're sort of part of this like national battle, right? And they sort of had to keep up with they felt, the Republicans in other states. They said, we'd rather not do that. And if we could find a partner state that would sort of be willing to trade their unfairness for our unfairness, we could be fair together. And we'd like to start with a conversation about the multi-member districts and see if we might sort of agree to do that. And then they'd sort of sign an agreement, take to Congress and say, hey, Congress, will you let us do this? And they'd have to let Congress do that. So that's at least a creative approach. For ranked choice voting, should be a statutory issue for Colorado state elections. So the Colorado state legislature could pass it. They have passed a bill to use to enable ranked choice voting in more localities. That passed in 2008. Senator Kafalis was the sort of driver of that one, and it followed a task force that in 2007 kind of studied different methods and recommended that, and it passed. And it can be done it can be done at a local level as well.
You mentioned the Fair Representation Act is going to be introduced in Congress. Which Congress members or senators are sponsoring it?
The one who's most passionate about it, or sort of is going to be the lead sponsor, is a guy named Don Beyer, a congressman from Virginia. He's an interesting guy. He was lieutenant governor, so he'd won statewide in Virginia. Then he tried to be governor and lost. But he had an experience of kind of representing the whole state and engaging with voters across the state. And now he sort of represents a piece, and he represents his bubble where he won with like 75%, but he really thinks it would be sort of healthy to be able to run for more. My member of Congress is a guy named Jamie Raskin. He just got elected. He's excited to be part of that bill as well, and we expect several more. They're very confident they can get a number of people on the bill.
How much support are you getting from incumbent politicians?
Surprisingly, it's not uncommon, right? It's contextual, and I think that incumbents are often wanting to do the right thing, and they want to be sort of reassured often that it doesn't do the wrong thing to them, but that's sort of a natural instinct. I think ranked choice voting is a system that a confident incumbent can feel fine about, right? So if you feel that you're sort of there because you're sort of propped up by a system that somehow suppresses voter choice, and if somehow the voters were unleashed to like vote their preferences, you're gone. I would hope you just leave office anyway, right? Just quit, right? Like, but and a number of them are actually fine fine with that. There are some that are kind of like does this sort of allow third parties to kind of grow and change the country? But they're like, in 2008, John McCain and Barack Obama were the major party nominees. John McCain had endorsed ranked choice voting in Alaska, actually cut a robocall. You can listen to him on our website talking about that. And Barack Obama, as a state senator in Illinois, introduced ranked choice voting legislation. He actually also introduced legislation to put the multi-member district idea on the ballot in Illinois.
So it says on this card, IRV has been repealed in many cities, which can give all alternative methods a bad name. Why do people who use it reject IRV in so many cases?
One, it has been repealed in 3 cities, right? So it was repealed in Aspen, where my brother was living, and I used to like go visit him in Aspen. I can't do it anymore because he doesn't live there now. And I got chatting with like the city councilor there who would like won in a runoff. He said, man, it would have been nicer to not have to do a runoff, and sort of talked about how ranked choice voting would be an improvement over that. He thought it was a good idea, talked with his fellow councilors, put it on the ballot, got 77%. They used it, actually had the highest turnout that they'd ever had in the first use of it, but it had a really competitive election, and he lost in the city council race. The city council race in a particular was one that was interesting because it was a 2-candidate race, and or 2-winner race, and they kind of came up with sort of a novel way to do ranked choice voting. And it was almost like a 5-way tie for first. Some people were sort of dissatisfied with the outcome, and there were some issues with the implementation, and Harvey would probably know about some of those as well. And they, kind of like a town, they didn't put a lot of money into sort of implementation. They made some choices which should have been better. They put it up for there was sort of enough kind of discontent afterward. They put it up as an advisory measure. Do you want to keep the system? And it lost by 7 votes. So they then kept the conversation going. And the system that people said, well, this will be sort of make life easier. Why don't we just do 1 election, not 2? Just seemed like a pain to people, and they voted it out. The other 2 places were sort of like, I went into detail there because it's sort of contextual, right? But we have passed it in like 15 cities. A dozen of them are using it. I don't see any other repeals likely. There may be some people trying, but it seems to be settling in places using it. I can't promise that it wouldn't be repealed again. If something can be won by initiative, it can be repealed by initiative. The thing that's interesting about ranked choice voting, if you think about the math of it, is when it's interesting and the race is close, and there's more than 2 candidates, most people will not elect, their first choice will not, most people's first choice will not win, right? So if it's like 38 to 32 to 26 or something like that, right? Even when ranked choice voting produces a winner who wins with a majority in the final round, in the first round, 62% voted for someone else. And they can say, man, I wonder if a runoff might have made a difference, or that different system. And so you have to really work to make sure that the system is sort of understood throughout the process. And I think that some of the early adoptions, and Aspen is a good example, we didn't do anything to kind of help in implementation. Sort of like, visited Aspen, talked to my brother, they passed it, hoped it goes well, and they made some mistakes in the implementation, and they sort of could have done probably a better job explaining it to people and so on. And so now we're sort of more attentive to the fact that it's a beginning, middle, and end, and the end kind of keeps going for a while, right? You have to sort of make sure that people are ready for the system. But I'm confident that and certainly the international history suggests that we can have long, sustained use of it. And I think that once it crosses a certain threshold of use, it becomes less exotic, and it becomes something that people are just used to.
So in Boulder, Colorado, we use the multi-seat version of instant runoff voting called single transferable vote. And when we did research back in 2013, my understanding for the reason for getting rid of it was that too many communists were getting elected.
Right, and I should add, I'm talking about sort of the modern era of uses. There were earlier uses, and I would say generally that, so it was adopted in these multi-winner reforms, almost always as part of the sort of progressive kind of era of reformers, in some good government people kind of reforming like sort of relatively corrupt machine government. I'm not sure if that was true in Boulder, but it sort of like was a sort of a reformer sort of, you know, getting the old guard and changing a system that really like changed the way that they could control elections and really had powerful positive impacts and made some serious enemies. And so they got a lot of repeal attempts early. Here's sort of an interesting history about these sort of early history of the multi-winner ranked choice voting. Up until 1945, there had been passes. I think it ultimately was used in about 20-some cities, and there had been like something like 25 repeal attempts, and only 2 had been successful. So almost all these other repeal attempts were sort of beaten back. But then, after 1945, we sort of entered a different era, and an era of sort of this Cold War era, and communists had one in New York City. So they had it in New York City, the system. And they tried to repeal it 3 times there, then a communist elected, and you could say, oh, look at that. You know, 1 out of 23, isn't that incredibly awful that we have sort of that kind of representation? And sort of whipped up sort of a McCarthy era kind of thing. And so it got repealed in 47, and 16 of the next 23 repeals won. And so at that time, race became to be an issue too, because it was very effective in representing racial minorities, and that wasn't really embraced at that time as much as one might wish. But also, the reformers kind of didn't stick around as much as the old guard.
So in ranked choice voting, if there are 3 candidates, do you have to rank all 3? And I think you might also want to address 15 candidates, or, you know.
Right.
Or can you not rank a candidate, no vote for that person, if you just couldn't support him or her? And I think you basically answered this question already, but.
Yeah. So how many of you have been to Australia? Man, I haven't been to Australia. But congratulations. But when you go to Australia, they have mandatory voting in Australia. So they have really high turnout. And they have mandatory ranking. They have mandatory ranking with ranked choice voting. So they really, really, really want you to indicate your preference between sort of the final 2, right? So they require you to rank the candidates. So if you rank only 5 in a 9-candidate race, then your ballot is not counted. And you're forced to choose. I hate Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. You know, you've got to choose, or your ballot won't count, right? You know that it's sort of like that is not done anywhere else that has ranked choice voting, and I don't expect it will be done here. It could, and if you really, really, really wanted to make sure that the final round totals of the winner was a majority of the ballots that count in the first round, you would always succeed in doing that if you require someone to rank everybody. But we accept the right of abstention and the right of not being able to rank someone. But the more interesting the race is to people, the more they tend to rank. And the uses of it now have been almost all nonpartisan races. Say, Minneapolis mayor's race with 35 candidates. They have a ballot design, which I think is actually not a very good ballot design, tied to their current voting equipment. But they only had 3 rankings allowed. But I believe usually this is sort of an interesting sort of thread. About 90% of people rank 2, and about 75% tend to rank 3 in these situations. I think Minneapolis might have been 78% ranked 3. But then if you go to like some lower profile city council race, you know, maybe only 60% of people rank 2 or something, right? It's, you know, there's less of attention to it. But enough people are ranking that the winners are getting more votes. Like Oakland passed ranked choice voting. Used to have a system where you could win in June if you got 50% and then go to November if you didn't get that. Now they have their elections always in November. And with ranked choice voting, you sort of end up having to accumulate more votes. In the first 18 people that won, there's 18 seats elected in Oakland, 16 of those winners had more votes than the preceding candidate had, winning with the non-ranked choice voting election system. So you're sort of winning with more votes. I'll say about the Bay Area, people might be interested in this sort of change in the sort of the political culture of it, is there's 53 seats overall elected by ranked choice voting in the 4 Bay Area cities. They now have elections where turnout is higher, The campaigns, probably a little less negative, a little more kind of figure out how to build coalitions. The number of people of color in office in those 53 seats is now 60%, more than 60%, and it used to be, I think when they started, before they had ranked choice voting, something more like 40. And the number of seats held by women is almost 60% as well. And that's something that a number of the big high-profile races for mayor have been won by women in a way that it seems like maybe they could adapt to that culture of like working on how to win second and third choices quicker. But sort of an interesting factor.
So getting back to, a couple things I wanted to say. When you can vote for more than one person and you only vote for one, we call that bullet voting in voting methods talk. And the other thing, if you only vote for one or you vote for two and then you end up, your vote, your first choice and your second choice are eliminated, so then you don't have a third choice, that's called an exhausted ballot or an inactive ballot, so you might hear those terms. Next question, back to Australia. The experience of Australian voters I've spoken to has led me to believe that tactical voting is still a problem. Range voting, however, permits voters to express nuanced opinions, including indifference. So we haven't really talked about range or score voting, so would you like to do that?
Sure. So there is going to be a talk, we should maybe do an advertisement. There's going to be, when is the next talk going to be that's about? February 21st, where there's going to be sort of an in-depth presentation on approval and score voting?
We'll cover score voting.
Yeah, score voting. So in some ways, approval is kind of a limited kind of score voting. So score voting is a system where you've probably done something that's like score voting in some kind of part of your life, right? Where you rate each candidate, and you could have different scales, but let's say it's 1 to 5, 1 to 10, whatever it might be, and you say, I'll give that person a 7. I'll give that, let's not do that kind of talk. I will rate that person an 8, that person a 5, whatever. And then everyone kind of casts these ratings, then you just add up all the points associated with the ratings. If someone's rated 8, they get 8 points. You add up all the points, and the one with the most points wins. So you're sort of expressing preferences among everyone that actually count simultaneously. One of the things that I think is really key to making ranked choice voting actually work in practice, and I really wanted to stress that working in practice, your ballot doesn't count for more than one candidate at a time. Some people see that as a flaw because they say, I want my ballot to count for more than one candidate at a time. But my experience has been, and when we sort of see ranked choice voting used in practice, is that people want to be reassured that it's not doing that. Because, okay, it's not, like if they think it's a point system, then they start thinking a different way about how to vote smartly and so on. So the issue with range voting, and I'll say this in general, is there's sort of a theoretical way that like how computers might vote, but human beings are governed by psychology and about sort of their sort of emotional connection to candidates and so on, and it's not all rational, but there's enough rational about sort of once you feel a connection to someone that you don't necessarily want your vote to count for more than one person at a time. So with a rating system, you'd be saying, well, here's a 9 and here's a 6, and you've expressed a gradation of difference, but you've given 6 points to that other candidate, and those 6 points could be the decisive votes that cause your candidate with 9 points to lose, right? So that's sort of the challenge of it, and we'll see. It hasn't really been used, I don't know of sort of, like we've seen some use of approval, much fewer uses of kind of range voting in even non-governmental elections, but I'm skeptical that when people really care about the choices that will work the way that people hope it will.
Short question, where does Fair Vote get funding?
From people like you. We have been around for about 25 years. It took a long time to get us more funding, but we have, just to give you a sense of maybe why so many people are in the room tonight, but also sort of what the feelings people have right now, our number of individual donors has quadrupled in the last 4 months. That's after 25 years working, exciting to people. Part of it was a feeling that electoral process matters, right? So we do get a good bit from individuals, there's some foundations that support us too. The two biggest foundations that support us are the Hewlett Foundation and the Arnold Foundation and the Democracy Fund are the three biggest foundations.
Okay, changing gears here. Could you cover the pros and cons of a unicameral legislature in Colorado using a parliamentary proportional representation system modeled after Norway versus
I'll give you the question.
Sure.
a ranked choice voting single-member district modification of the plurality system we have now?
Right. But so you all know about the Norway system. So you know. Here's what I'll say, Jackie, wherever you are. But European democracies universally use proportional representation for at least one of their national elections. Universally, right? And all but I think France and the UK use it for their main parliamentary elections. Some kind of non-winner-take-all system. I'll give you an example of one that I think is a pretty cool system to consider. They have it in New Zealand, and I got to go to this national referendum in '93 and be part of that effort. They wanted an American to come speak, and I was, got to go speak, and it got outspent 10-1, and it won. It's a system where you have half the seats that are single-member districts, half where you vote for a party. You fill all the single-member district seats. You look at the party vote that people cast, and you compensate for any distortions that happen in sort of the seats to vote relationship, and you sort of add in seats from the list, and you overall get a parliament that reflects the party vote, even while half the seats are filled with someone who represents each of the districts. And that's kind of an interesting system, right? Everyone can get their local rep and vote for the local rep they want, and everyone can get a vote that almost certainly helps elect their preferred party. And it's a party-based system. So that's the challenge. And I actually don't know for exactly particulars of the Norway system, but a lot of the Scandinavian countries use some kind of open degree of an open party list where you get to express some degree of preference for candidates that while also voting for parties. And so, and I know the one I know best is the Finland system, where you say you might have 10 seats being filled. You go in as a voter and you vote for one person, and that counts for the person, but it counts for the person's party as well. And if a party wins, say, 40% of the vote, it's earned 4 out of 10 seats, and those 4 seats are filled by the 4 most popular individual candidates from that party, right? So you're sort of party defined, but candidate defined as well, right? So countries do a lot of different things. So what a proportional system does, and when I was talking about the Fair Representation Act, that's a kind of a proportional system, is that it allows like-minded voters to win representation wherever they are and kind of connect with people, not just based on where they live, but on what they think. And there's a whole range of ways to do it, and there's not sort of a single approach. And so people think like, oh, what they have in like Israel. Israel has a proportional system. I would never want that. Well, just don't have that kind of proportional system, right? There's other kind of systems. Netherlands has the same one as Israel and seems to work okay there, right? So it's sort of like it all depends. But I think for Colorado, the conversation that people would need to have would include, do you want a party-defined system? And what would that mean? And that's a whole important conversation. I think like worthy of debate. I think that it's a leap within our political culture. That's sort of the conclusion that I have. But I think it's really worth a conversation. If you have ranked choice voting in single-member districts, you would sort of open up choice in those districts. There's sort of different ways that you might do it. You could say, let's not even have primaries. Let's just go straight to the November election. Let's have the parties nominate in their caucuses and conventions, but anyone who wants to can go to the November ballot. That wouldn't provide proportional representation, but it would probably open up a lot of choice in a lot of the districts. So there's different ways, but if you did say Maine-style ranked choice voting, where they keep the primaries, use ranked choice voting in the primaries, then use it in November, and the major parties have their nominees, and then any independents and third parties get there too. It only really sort of noticeably is different when there's sort of strong third parties and independents. And you'd have to see how often that happens. It probably doesn't happen that often now, and you'd have to see, would this sort of change the culture? where you might see it more often. So one would have a lot more impact on a lot more people. The other sort of just frees up choice and sort of deals with the distortions that you can get when you have you have more than 2 people around. So it's less of a sort of a dramatic change, but I think it's a really important change to do the ranked choice voting if that's the one that you did. But I would certainly welcome conversation about the other sort of European system. I believe that the best way to consider some kind of proportional system in a state like Colorado would be to look at, say, multi-member districts. So you could have, say, 3-member districts or 5-member districts, and then use a ranked choice system. And there's other variations, but I'll say the ranked choice system is a good candidate-based system. And it would sort of open up representation to more people, but it would probably end up with a legislature that kind of has a culture of operation that would be at least relatively consistent with what we have today.
So there's a question here that asks about how single transferable vote combats gerrymandering, but single transferable vote is used in multi-winner districts, so I don't think that gerrymandering is an aspect of that, correct? If you have a big district, it's not. So I just wanted to bring that up.
I'll briefly address it briefly.
Before you do, we are almost out of time, so I want to say that after this event, there's going to be another event at Chili's Bar and Grill on US 287 here in Lafayette. So Rob will be there if you'd like to chat with him some more. So.
Okay. So you've all heard of gerrymandering, but just to make sure, gerrymandering is the practice of legislators being able to carve out constituencies and sort of help their friends and hurt their enemies. Sort of primitive justice is played on my side. Right? And you see it a lot in the United States, and you see it almost never anywhere else, right? It's kind of like our whole fight over sort of whether secretaries of states can be trusted to kind of hold honest elections, a very sort of American phenomenon. You see it, in countries that don't have very strong democracies, but sort of like countries that have sort of respected democracies, we sort of settled on those things. So usually you see, like Canada, they have like civil servants run the districts, and it's a pretty non-controversial thing. But the impact of the district lines is still there, and because winner take all, and most districts are not going to be competitive, and so on. So gerrymandering can have an intentional impact and an unintentional impact. And even if you draw like fair lines, like California has an independent redistricting commission, and the number of intrinsically competitive seats is exactly the same as it was before. If you look at the underlying partisanship of the districts, it didn't get any different at all for Congress. It just shook up incumbents for a couple cycles because they had to run in different districts, but now they sort of settled in, and they haven't had no congressional incumbent lost to someone of another party in the last 2 elections, the last 106 California House matches. What ranked choice voting in multi-member districts, or the single transferable vote, is essentially undoes intentional or unintentional gerrymandering by sort of putting voters in a chance to define their representation. The last stat I'll just throw at you is we did this fun study of Washington State. They have 10 congressional districts, and we tried to do, we worked with someone who was able to gerrymander the best Republican gerrymander that he could do and the best Democratic gerrymander that he could do. And there was like 7 or 8 seats for the Democrats being able to win out of 10 with the Democratic one, and maybe Republicans win, I think could win 7 when they had their plan. So pretty big swing. If you then said, what if each of those districts had 5 seats instead of 1? And the state senate in Washington is about that size. So you had 5 seats in each of those districts. And you used ranked choice voting, where everyone would sort of, if you get 51%, you get 3 out of 5.
Single transferable vote.
Yeah, single transferable vote. But we just call it ranked choice voting sort of for both. And if you use that system, the partisan impact was almost completely erased. The Republican gerrymander and the Democratic gerrymander plans generate almost exactly the same partisan outcomes projected for a 5 seat. So anyway, if you really want to deal with gerrymandering, both in that sort of partisan way, but also that sense of allowing voters to be in positions of holding an opportunity to vote for their preferred candidate, we think that's the ultimate answer.
I'm going to pass the mic off to Ruth, and you want to, I see you have the special card, the action card.
Yeah. So, thank you, Rob. I think we're going to wrap it up, and we need to be out of this room, so we need to pick up some things. So let's first say thank you to Rob.
So thank you, and I really appreciate all of you being here, sticking this out, and I'd love to have a conversation. I did want to mention again that Chris has started a group to work on ranked choice voting in Colorado. It's sort of tied to sort of networks that we've seen in a number of states of people trying to do this. And there's, I think, really interesting opportunities to think about. Once you apply yourself to thinking about where it might make sense, you almost always are going to find some fun opportunities. So we really look forward to working with you and others that want to do this. And we're at a point in time where I think these ways we're holding elections, we need to kind of rethink them. And I'll just sort of mention again about this Maine campaign. Was, I think, a really exciting example of people just sort of challenging the conventional wisdom that these things are hard to win, and they went out and won, and it's going to be used in 2018 for governor, U.S. Senate, U.S. House, and 185 state legislative seats. So we'll see, but it's going to be exciting. So anyways, thanks so much, and I hope you connect with Chris as well. And check and be in touch with Fair Vote if you sort of want to stay in touch too, and obviously go link. So thank you.
Thank you again. As the League of Women Voters, Boulder County, we're glad that you came for this important educational event. We are also determined this year to inspire you to go out and take some action, not just education, but although education is important. So we have over there at the table some what we're calling action cards. So for Boulder County residents, these are your national and state representatives, and we encourage you to stay in very close touch with them in these times and let them know how you're feeling about the issues, ranked choice voting or whatever the issue may be. So please pick up an action card, and we encourage you to use that. Part 2 in the More Choices for Voters series will be held, as we've already said, in this same location on Tuesday, February 21st. We hope everyone will join us.
What time?
6 o'clock to 7:30 again. And we'll also be live on Facebook again. We're assuming it worked just fine, and we're going to try it again. And a little announcement for members, if there's some League of Women Voters members here. Liz Black is our membership person, and she's in the back, and she may have some handouts for you. So check with Liz before you leave. Thank you again for coming.